Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the Code of Hammurabi, which I'm reading out of Michael Austin's Reading the World, Ideas That Matter, the first edition. So Hammurabi's Code is one of the most important documents in history because it's the first time, as far as we know, that there was a single enshrined code of laws that applied across an empire, in this case the ancient Babylonian Empire. As Michael says here in the introduction to this, he says, scholars of the ancient world have long known that sometime between 2400 and 1700 BCE, a warrior king named Hammurabi conquered Mesopotamia and founded the Babylonian Empire. But not until a stone inscribed with Hammurabi's code was found in Persia in 1901 did scholars understand the extent of this warrior king's contributions to the development of law. Hammurabi's code is a list of 282 laws that were engraved on stone tablets and circulated to magistrates throughout the Babylonian Empire. The laws are clear and direct, and they contain the major elements found in modern legal codes: list of punishable behaviors, rules of evidence, mitigating circumstances, and appropriate punishments. So, this is, again, a revolution in law, in the idea of law itself, because having an encoded set of laws eliminates a lot of the arbitrariness of legal decision-making that would have been characteristic of the ancient world. I mean, if you have a prescribed set of laws that everyone in the empire is bound by and everyone in the empire can understand, then you have a situation in which it's no longer a question of a local judge or magistrate's decision about what kind of actions constitute a crime and what kind of punishment is appropriate for them. If the law is inscribed and if the law is universal, or at least universal across the empire, then you have an actual functioning system. And again, this is the basis of every modern legal system in the world today, is this fundamental idea that laws should be enshrined and that they should be consistently applied. So Hammurabi himself describes the purpose of the law code in his introduction to it. He sort of describes a little bit of mythical background with some gods and kings and things like this. And then he says, "Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash and enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind." So this is a sort of liberatory law code, but it's about establishing justice, righteousness, equality before the law. Not equality before the law in terms of everyone is treated the same, as we'll see in just a second, but equality before the law in terms of everyone knows where they stand relative to the law based on their particular social position. So, probably the most famous thing in Hammurabi's law code is enshrined between about Law 196 and Law 214. And this is a series of laws that are retributive. They establish very clearly and specifically, if you do this punishment shall be done to you. And actually we get a lot more of that, but these are the ones that are very sort of direct, and they're clearly encoding social difference. So there's a difference in the punishment. There are different punishments based on the person's status relative to you. So if you are a freeborn man and you commit a crime against a freeborn man, the punishment is different than if you commit a crime against a slave. If you are a freed person, a freedman who was a slave and is no longer a slave, and you commit a crime against a freeborn person, the punishment is different than if you commit a crime against another freedman or a slave. But a lot of the laws here, and this is the famous part of it, are basically oriented toward a sort of equality between the punishment and the crime. So Law 196, which is one of the famous ones, is if a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. 197, if he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. So this idea of the punishment is going to match the crime or fit the crime is enshrined in the law here alongside social distance, alongside social difference, because the next one, 198, is if he put out the eye of a freed man or break the bone of a freed man, he shall pay 1 gold mina. So, if you are a freeborn man and you put out the eye of another freeborn man, you lose your eye. If you put out the eye of a freedman, someone who was born a slave and then set free, you pay a fine. Or, if you put out the eye of a man-slave, this is 199, or break the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 of its value. So, pay a hefty fine for injuring a freed man. You pay a lesser fine for injuring a slave. So these are some of the things that are really central in Hammurabi's code. And again, this encodes not only a sense of retributive justice, but it also encodes a social hierarchy. And there's a lot of them here that sort of say for different tiers, this is the different thing. This is the different punishments. One of the things that I find really striking, though, about Hammurabi's code is there's some degree of protection for women. So, we talk about social hierarchies, and one of the most fundamental hierarchies throughout many ancient societies was gender. Men versus women. These are patriarchal societies across the board, and there's a lot of patriarchal stuff in Hammurabi's code. But there are also some protections enshrined for women. Some of them have to do with being raped and the compensation that you get for being raped or things like this. But 142, 148, and 149 are some of the most striking for me. So in 142, he says, if a woman quarrel with her husband and say, "You are not congenial to me," the reasons for her prejudice must be presented. If she is guiltless and there is no fault on her part, but he leaves and neglects her, then no guilt attaches to this woman. She shall take her dowry and go back to her father's house. So basically, if your husband is neglectful, abusive, abandons you, whatever it is, not only do you, as the wife, get to choose to leave that marriage, you also get back the money that was given as the dowry. Similarly, we get protections in 148 and 149. 148 says, if a man take a wife and she be seized by disease, if he then desire to take a second wife, he shall not put away his wife, who has been attacked by disease, but he shall keep her in the house which he has built and support her so long as she lives. And 149 says, if this woman does not wish to remain in her husband's house, then he shall compensate her for the dowry and that she brought with her from her father's house, and she may go. So again, we have protections for women here in the sense that you can't say, wife, you're sick. I cast you out of my house, but I'm keeping your dowry money. Either the husband is obligated to care for that wife for as long as she lives, or he has to give back the money that she brought with her and let her return to her family. So we've got these protections that are really quite revolutionary in many ways. And actually, until the 19th or 20th centuries in European and US, Canadian, Australian, etc., societies, these were not rights that women necessarily had. So in that case, this is really quite a revolutionary and egalitarian document. Although again, it's not egalitarian. It is heavily based on class distinctions. One of the other things that's striking about Hammurabi's code is that it defines very specific things, very specific requirements, limitations, obligations, etc. So, for instance, laws 215 through 225 are about what compensation doctors should receive, what penalties they have to pay if they botch an operation on a freeborn man, a freedman, or a slave, what compensation and penalties they need to pay for successful or unsuccessful operations on animals, etc. We get the same thing, same kinds of guidelines for builders. If you build a good house, here's what you need to be compensated. If you build a house that falls down and it kills the homeowner, here's what you need to pay. If it kills the homeowner's children, here's what the builder is fined. If it destroys the homeowner's property, here's what the builder is fined, etc. Same thing with shipwrights. So we just have these very distinct sets of specific laws. And then the last thing I want to talk about that's interesting about Hammurabi's code is that there are specific guidelines for providing evidence, and there's specific guidelines for what happens if you bring an unfounded case against someone. So actually the first 4 laws are basically about putting to death people who bring cases that they can't prove. So if you make false accusations against someone, you get put to death. But then we move on, and there are specific guidelines for who has to bring what kinds of witnesses in what cases. So, like, if someone steals your possession and sells it to someone else, then you and the person who bought that piece of stolen property both need to go to court, and you both need to bring witnesses, and that will establish that the merchant who sold it to that other person is a thief and needs to be punished. If the person who bought the stolen goods can't bring any witnesses that they legitimately bought it, then they're considered the thief and put to death. And if you accuse someone of having your property, of buying your property from someone else, and you can't bring any witnesses that prove that that was your property, then you're considered to be bringing a false accusation. So it's remarkably detailed about legal procedures, about penalties for crimes, about who has standing, about what kinds of things are considered crimes, etc. And again, because it's detailed and because it's universally applicable, it gives us the foundation for the law as we know it today.